In a packed congressional hearing broadcast to over 11.3 million viewers, Jasmine Crockett faced off against Senator Josh Hawley, who accused her of manipulating public trust and exploiting women's issues. But just 72 hours before, Jasmine had received three damning images, captured at a secretive SpaceX gathering, revealing Hawley's own wife in a moment of undeniable intimacy with Elon Musk. The room froze. The video went viral in under 6 minutes. What secret did she expose that made one of the Senate's loudest voices vanish overnight? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing room was electric, dozens of cameras live streaming every breath to millions across the nation. Then came Josh Hawley, sleeves rolled, eyes sharp. He moved like a hunter entering the arena. His every step was rehearsed dominance, chin high, smirk loaded, ready to attack. He took his seat across from Jasmine Crockett like a man expecting submission. The room tensed. Staffers stilled. Reporters raised their pens. Hawley leaned into the mic, poised for political bloodshed. But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't move. She just looked up and smiled. Not a polite smile, a knowing, surgical smirk. It was the kind of smile that said, "I've already won. You just don't know it yet." That expression would be replayed everywhere within hours. But in that instant, it was a warning Hawley missed completely. Because while he came to conquer, Jasmine came to end a lie. With silence, with timing, with truth. And just like that, the game began. Not with shouting, not with spectacle, but with precision honed in back rooms and briefing binders. Josh Hawley leaned forward, his tone smooth but laced with venom. The voice of a man who'd never been told no by a room that didn't look like him. His first question wasn't a question at all. It was an accusation dressed in policy language. "Congresswoman, in last year's budget markup, you diverted $18 million from federal enforcement toward what you labeled community-based harm reduction. Would you care to explain how that improves border integrity?" He didn't wait for an answer. "And your amendment to expand asylum access under Title 42 exemptions, was that before or after the 22% increase in illegal crossings last quarter?" Another blow. "Do you even read the DHS threat assessments, or do you just rewrite them to fit your activist ideology?" His rhythm was relentless, his cadence engineered for television. Every number was cherry-picked, every clause twisted, every pause designed to tighten the noose. It wasn't debate, it was ambush in slow motion. The chair said nothing. No one interjected. No objection on tone. No acknowledgement of the double standard playing out in real time. Because this was normalized. A white senator with institutional clout using layered bureaucracy to delegitimize a black congresswoman on national television. He weaponized the microphone like it was a gavel of moral authority, pounding down not just on her policy, but her credibility. And still, Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She didn't fumble for papers, didn't dart her eyes to staffers, didn't shift in her seat. Her pen tapped once against the table. Rhythm even, controlled. Her posture didn't budge, straight-backed, grounded, completely unshaken. Her eyes stayed locked on Hawley, not with defiance, but with diagnostic calm, like a surgeon studying a tumor before the first incision. Her silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. While he accused, she assessed. While he spun narratives, she took notes, precisely, methodically, like someone marking the precise second the enemy overplays his hand. And still he pressed on. "You've supported reducing mandatory detention thresholds by 40%, Congresswoman. Are you aware that 12 of the individuals released under similar frameworks were later tied to trafficking networks?" Another loaded question, another misused stat. Jasmine didn't answer. She simply drew a single line under the last note she'd written, then calmly folded the page. The cameras caught everything. The stillness of her breath, the discipline in her grip, the unreadable expression that had already become a symbol. It was a portrait of patience under siege, of a woman boxed in by rules never meant to protect her, and refusing to let the box define her. Hawley had the spotlight, but Jasmine had the clock, and she knew exactly how much time was left before he walked straight into the truth she was holding in her hands. But in the brief pause after his final blow, before the next calculated jab could leave his mouth, she did something no one expected. She smiled. Not a full smile. Not a forced, press-friendly grin. It was precise, intentional. A slow, subtle lift at the edge of her lips, barely visible yet deeply unnerving. It wasn't an expression of joy. It was a message coded in stillness, sharpened by restraint. A signal that said, I see everything you're doing, and I'm not just unbothered, I'm ahead of you. The kind of smile that, when worn by a woman like her, in a room like this, meant the ground was about to shift. And for the first time since the hearing began, it wasn't Jasmine Crockett who was under the microscope. It was Josh Hawley. The atmosphere turned viscous, like air thickening with the scent of something burning just out of sight. A junior press aide behind the camera bank stiffened, then slowly lowered his tablet. Two political correspondents at the back exchanged quiet, instinctive glances. Not out of confusion, but out of shared understanding. Something had just changed. They'd seen hearings turn on far less. And now every twitch of Hawley's brow, every shift in his posture, was being watched not for substance, but for weakness. It wasn't just what Jasmine did. It was the fact that she did so little, yet said so much. She had been cornered, underestimated, dissected on live television by a man who believed the balance of power was etched into his title. But power in this moment wasn't about who spoke loudest. It was about who could stay still while everyone else unraveled. And now Hawley, confident, rehearsed, and cruel, was beginning to sweat beneath the weight of a silence he didn't know how to control. What had started as a political interrogation was dissolving into something more dangerous, a reckoning, personal and televised. And while the chamber air turned brittle under Hawley's performance, Jasmine already held a deeper truth, one that wasn't hypothetical or rhetorical, but real, documented, and quietly ticking like a timed charge. It had arrived 5 nights earlier, at 11:42 p.m., as she sat alone in her Capitol Hill apartment with her shoes kicked off, documents fanned across her lap, and the muted glow of the city outside her window. Her phone buzzed once. Just once. A message preview lit the screen. Ayanna Blackwell, a name from another life, another war. Ayanna had been her closest friend in undergrad, sharp-tongued, brilliant, now a rising force in venture capital out of Austin. Jasmine opened the text. It read, Jazz. You're gonna want to see this. And no, it's not a joke. Attached were 2 photos, low light, cropped from a rooftop vantage. But what they lacked in resolution, they made up for in gravity. Elon Musk, undeniably him, stood at the edge of a private rooftop gala, drink in hand, collar loosened, his focus entirely fixed on a woman beside him. Her face was turned slightly away, but Jasmine didn't need clarity to recognize the shape of that jawline, the fall of that chestnut hair, the elegant, minimal posture of someone who had spent years mastering how not to look like she was trying. Bronwyn Lang, the wife of Senator Josh Hawley, and she wasn't just with Elon, she was into him. One hand rested gently on his wrist, her head tilted just enough, lips parted mid-laugh. The distance between them, non-existent. It wasn't posed, it wasn't polite. It was practiced intimacy, the kind you don't fake under camera lights unless you no longer care who's watching. Jasmine zoomed in slowly, her thumb steady on the glass, but her mind already racing. This wasn't scandal for scandal's sake. This was leverage. This was the fracture line behind a man who'd spent years framing her as undisciplined, untrustworthy, unfit to legislate. Hawley, who made speeches about biblical values and posted Christmas photos like propaganda, had no idea that his entire platform was now hanging by the thinnest thread. Bronwyn's gaze, frozen mid-laugh, at the wrong man, in the wrong city, at the wrong time. Jasmine didn't text back. She didn't panic. She simply stared at the image until it seared itself into her memory, because she understood the magnitude of what she'd been handed. In a town built on whispers and reputation, this wasn't gossip. This was a weapon, and Jasmine Crockett didn't wield weapons lightly. She didn't release the photos, not because they weren't explosive, because they were, but because she understood something Hawley never had to. When you live in a system built to discredit you the moment you push back, your most dangerous weapon is restraint. Jasmine Crockett knew that if those images came from her hand, they'd be twisted within hours. Headlines would shift from senator's wife in scandal to congresswoman orchestrates personal attack. She'd be called bitter, emotional, unhinged. Three words men like Josh had used for years to silence women who spoke too clearly. So instead of firing the gun, she placed it gently on the table and walked away. She chose patience over provocation, precision over spectacle. She didn't need to ignite the fire. She just needed to open the window and let the wind carry smoke where it needed to go. Her first move was surgical, a quiet lunch with a policy editor from the Hill, someone with a reputation for discretion and an ear tuned to the frequency of unspoken truths. She let one sentence slip, laced in ambiguity. "Isn't it wild what shows up at private galas these days?" The editor raised an eyebrow. That was enough. The next day, she DM'd a podcaster she once mentored, a rising voice in Beltway media known for threading cultural gossip into political critique. Jasmine didn't send files. She asked a question. "You ever hear rumors about Bronwyn Lang and tech money?" A breadcrumb, nothing more. Finally, she called in her most unconventional asset, Miles, her youngest staffer, an expert in the dark arts of Twitter, Reddit threads, and Discord leaks. "There's chatter coming," she said. "Don't start it. Just watch it. Amplify the right whispers when they land." She didn't script the story. She let it write itself. Because Jasmine knew that in Washington, truth doesn't always roar. It spreads in looks, in rumors, in half-heard phrases between elevator doors. And when wielded properly, it doesn't just expose corruption. It makes the powerful destroy themselves. And while the machinery of gossip quietly churned beneath the surface of Capitol Hill, Josh Hawley continued striding through his week like a man wrapped in armor forged from his own delusions. The cameras still followed him. The op-eds still quoted him. He smiled for fundraisers, lectured on moral decay, and prepared for his next televised sparring match, completely unaware that the ground beneath him had already been mined. He thought he was the one holding the matchstick. He didn't know Jasmine Crockett had the blueprints to the entire building. She hadn't stumbled on the truth by accident. She had built the path to it. After receiving the rooftop photos, Jasmine had quietly reached out to a former law school colleague, now embedded at a boutique compliance firm in D.C., the kind of place that dealt in discreet document recovery and knew which questions not to ask. What she received back was chilling in its precision. Bronwyn Lang's full travel manifest for the previous month. 3 flights, all logged through Hawley's discretionary accounts. 1 trip to Austin, private carrier. No return flight. A secondary confirmation came from a car service registry, noting a black SUV dispatched from the tarmac to the Lauren Hotel. The same location tagged in the background of Ayana's rooftop shots. Jasmine didn't have to guess where Bronwyn had been. She had the metadata, she had the timestamps, and she had an unshakable narrative that fit like a lock clicking shut. She didn't relish what she found. There was no thrill in it, no glee. Just the cold, familiar weight of reality, the kind that only women like her were ever expected to carry without complaint. Because if the roles were reversed, if she were the one with a partner in scandal, it wouldn't be treated as political vulnerability. It would be her public execution. She would be dragged, humiliated, painted as unfit to lead before she ever had a chance to speak. But Hawley, he would be protected by the machine, until the machine could no longer deny what the whispers had become. Jasmine knew that moment was coming. She just had to wait, not for vengeance, not for spectacle, but for the exact second the mask he wore began to slip under its own weight. And when it did, she wouldn't have to say a word. The facts would do the speaking for her. The moment was precise, engineered by silence, sharpened by timing, and detonated by 7 words. Jasmine didn't raise her voice, didn't shift her body, didn't even blink as she spoke. She simply let the quiet break like glass. "Josh," she said, each syllable as steady as stone, "do you really want to talk about the exploitation of women today?" It landed like a sniper's shot, no sound, no echo, just impact. For a heartbeat, the chamber didn't breathe. Reporters who had been halfway through writing their recaps paused, stunned mid-sentence. One aide on Hawley's side gasped softly and then immediately tried to hide it behind a cough. A senior advisor in the second row froze with his thumb hovering over a text message. He didn't hit send. All eyes moved to Josh Hawley, but he didn't speak. No, not right away, because there's a particular kind of silence that doesn't just interrupt, it condemns. And this was that silence, the kind that pours over everything and coats it in the thick, sticky sense of you've been caught. Hawley's jaw tensed. His fingers tapped once nervously against the polished wood of the desk. He cleared his throat, forced a twitch of a smirk. The one he'd used on cable news panels to make himself look unbothered, superior, untouchable. But it didn't fit this time. It stretched too tight across his face, didn't reach his eyes. He tried to speak. I think that's an evasion, Congresswoman, he said, voice an octave too high, the rhythm suddenly broken, like a man trying to play piano with gloves on. The words came out wrong, unbalanced. The swagger was gone. What remained was a flicker of something far more dangerous for a man like him. Uncertainty. Jasmine didn't move. That was the brilliance of it. She didn't need to. She remained exactly as she was. Composed, calm, pen in hand, as if she hadn't just dropped a rhetorical bomb on live television. Her eyes didn't narrow. Her posture didn't change. The only thing that shifted was the weight of the room itself, and it shifted hard. The hearing no longer belonged to Hawley, not the way he thought it did. What had begun as a political ambush, a calculated attempt to corner a black woman with layered policy jargon and subtle moral judgment, had just transformed into a moment of reckoning, and everyone in the room felt it. Because what Jasmine had just done wasn't clever wordplay. It wasn't a comeback line meant for social media. It was a trigger. One perfectly aimed sentence that weaponized not only the truth she held privately, but the hypocrisy that Josh Hawley had wrapped himself in publicly for years. And the timing couldn't have been more exact. She didn't fire too early. She didn't strike out of anger. She waited until he felt invincible, until he believed he had the upper hand, until he leaned all the way into his own self-righteousness. And then she pulled the floor out from under him with one line. And the injustice of it all pulsed beneath the surface like electricity. Because if she had faltered, if her voice had cracked, if her facts had been even a hair out of place, the scrutiny would have come down like thunder. She would have been called emotional, unprofessional, unstable. Pundits would have dissected her tone. The next day's headlines would have questioned her fitness to lead, her lack of composure, her partisan hostility. But Hawley? Even now, as his face flushed and his voice faltered, the room offered him the same quiet indulgence it always had. The kind that assumes men like him should be there, even when they have lost control of the room. But Jasmine had changed that, not by yelling, not by attacking, by asking a question that cut straight through the scaffolding of performance and exposed the foundation beneath. Hollow, unstable, cracked wide open. It was a question loaded with layers, legal, personal, moral, and every single person in the room could feel those layers, even if they didn't yet know the full story. Because it wasn't just a jab, it was a mirror, and Josh Hawley couldn't look directly into it without watching the image of himself distort. He tried to recover. That's not the topic of this hearing, he added, fumbling to steer the conversation back to policy. But the tone had shifted too drastically. He was no longer the prosecutor. He was the man blinking in bright lights, wondering who turned the cameras on at the worst possible second. And the most damning part, Jasmine didn't even follow up. She didn't pounce. She let the silence expand. Let his own discomfort do the unraveling. Because she knew, better than anyone, that sometimes the most brutal blow is the one that comes without force. Just gravity. The cameras were still rolling. The feeds were still live. But in that precise minute, the public didn't need to hear any more numbers. They didn't need another graph. They didn't need another quote. They just needed to see the frozen expression on his face, the stillness of hers, the imbalance between volume and control. And whether they knew the full backstory or not, every viewer across the country recognized the truth. Something had broken. And it wasn't her, it was him. And just as the silence began to rot into discomfort, Jasmine moved, not with anger, not with performance, but with the precision of someone who had waited for exactly the right moment. The moment when sound alone couldn't protect him, when the weight of truth would be heavier than any argument he could muster. She reached slowly into the inside pocket of her blazer and withdrew a small black USB drive. Nothing fancy, no label, no theatrics. She laid it on the table in front of Josh Hawley with the calm finality of a closing argument. Then, with both hands steady, she adjusted her microphone. Her voice didn't rise. It cut. "I think," she said, her tone surgical, "it's time I share something I've had for several days now. Something that doesn't just concern me, but every single person in this room, especially those who sit here pretending to be arbiters of morality." There was no response, no interruption, only breathless tension as she turned her laptop toward the central screen. One keystroke, and the room dimmed slightly as the monitors flickered to life. And then it appeared. Clear, undeniable footage projected in full resolution across the committee's digital display. A rooftop at night, the Austin skyline glowing behind the silhouettes of two people, Elon Musk, unmistakable in his signature swagger, and Bronwyn Lang, elegant in a navy silk dress, her posture leaning into him like gravity itself had chosen sides. There was no ambiguity. Bronwyn's hand brushed his lapel, her head tilted in toward his as she laughed. Not the polite kind reserved for donors or acquaintances, but the deep, unfiltered kind shared between people who thought no one was watching. But someone was. The room didn't explode. It froze. The silence grew heavier, not lighter. A low murmur broke out near the press benches as reporters began flipping open their laptops in near unison, the mechanical chorus of keys filling the dead air. One of the legal aides sitting 2 rows back stiffened, whispering into a phone with trembling fingers. Cameras panned slowly, carefully to Josh Hawley. He hadn't moved, but everything about him was different. His shoulders, once squared and rigid, had slumped by millimeters. His eyes were no longer on Jasmine. They were locked on the screen, unblinking. The smirk had vanished. In its place was a look Washington rarely ever captures in real time. The exact second a man realizes his armor's useless. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She didn't even look at him. Her focus remained on the screen, letting the images speak in the language that mattered most. Proof. It wasn't speculation. It wasn't a rumor she floated behind closed doors. It was evidence. Irrefutable. Undeniable. It was everything women like her were told never to rely on. Because even truth, when it comes from the mouths of black women, is too often dismissed as strategy, as manipulation, as anger misdirected. But this time the facts had arrived with a timestamp and an audience too large to ignore. One journalist near the back let out a slow, involuntary whistle. Another simply said, "Jesus Christ," under their breath. The chairman fidgeted awkwardly but said nothing. And Hawley, man of conviction, champion of virtue, sat paralyzed beneath the very standards he claimed to uphold. His silence, once a weapon, now betrayed him. And Jasmine? She just sat there, the screen behind her pulsing with light, letting the weight of the moment fall exactly where it belonged. On him. And as the initial video still flickered in the chamber's air like a dropped torch in a dry forest, Jasmine didn't flinch, didn't pause, didn't let the weight of the moment rest. She pressed on, because this was not the climax. This was only the beginning of what she had brought to the table. Her fingertip hovered briefly above the trackpad, then clicked once more, without fanfare, without flourish. The screen shifted again, this time to a new angle, tighter, closer, filmed from a different vantage point atop the same rooftop in Austin. The camera was slightly shaky, the frame cutting in and out of focus. But what it captured was crystalline. Bronwyn Lang's hand resting on Elon Musk's chest. Not accidentally, not socially, intimately. Her eyes met his in a way no camera should have seen. But it had. And now the whole nation would see it too. The feed continued, another clip. This time they were seated in a corner booth, far from the event's center, lit only by soft string lights and the low golden glow of evening. Elon leaned forward to speak, but Bronwyn didn't listen. She watched his lips as he moved, then smiled in response to something he hadn't finished saying. Her fingers grazed the sleeve of his jacket. It was the kind of touch that doesn't need explanation, because everyone in that room had felt it in their own lives, and they all understood what it meant. There was no plausible deniability left. No just friends. No taken out of context. Not when the context had been delivered in high resolution, time-stamped, and stitched together with such clinical clarity. Then came the stills. Jasmine's cursor moved again, and a cascade of images unfolded across the screen like pieces of a puzzle that no longer needed solving. A photo of Bronwyn entering the hotel lobby with Musk beside her. No aides, no entourage. Another of them sharing a drink beneath the terrace awning, heads close, oblivious to the outside world. And then, the one that broke the room's composure entirely. Bronwyn reaching up to adjust his collar, and Elon watching her hand as if it were the only thing that existed in the universe. The atmosphere in the chamber changed from tension to suffocation. Jasmine didn't narrate. She let the silence devour what was left of pretense. She didn't need to explain. She had simply turned the lights on, and now the entire room had no choice but to look. Reporters were scribbling in chaotic shorthand. Flashes blinked, laptops clacked. A producer near the C-SPAN feed booth was mouthing directions to his team. But the most telling reaction came not from the press bench, but from Josh Hawley himself. His hands, once folded confidently in front of him, had moved. Now they were clenched tightly on the edge of the table, knuckles white. His gaze was no longer fixed on Jasmine or even the screen. It was far away, locked on some invisible horizon where his carefully curated identity still existed. Untouched, intact, unchallenged. But it was gone. Torn apart not by a scandal, but by evidence. Layered, strategic, inarguable. Jasmine didn't even look at him. Not once. That was the final stroke of control. She didn't acknowledge him because she didn't need to. The story was no longer his to manipulate. It belonged to the images, the timeline, the body language, the contradictions he could no longer deny. She had presented it with restraint, not vengeance, with clarity, not chaos. And in doing so, she hadn't just revealed an affair, she had dismantled a fortress built on illusion. Brick by brick, frame by frame, truthfully, publicly, and irreversibly. And as the final image dissolved into black, the glow of the projector fading like the last ember of a fire no one could deny, the stillness that followed was not silence. It was collapse. The hearing room moments earlier, a theater of controlled aggression and choreographed optics, now hung suspended in something heavier, reality, the kind no press release could neutralize. No talking point could redirect. No title, senator, committee member, conservative standard bearer, could insulate. Jasmine didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The weight of the evidence still lingered in the air like smoke after detonation. She turned toward Hawley slowly, eyes locked, expression unwavering, sharp but calm, measured but unblinking. Her stare said what no headline would have the courage to say outright. "You were never untouchable. You were just untested." Josh Hawley sat frozen, not figuratively, literally. His mouth slightly parted, his tongue moving, trying to form a counter, a dismissal, anything, but nothing came. The flush in his cheeks deepened into something unnatural, more panic than embarrassment. His hands remained planted flat on the table, but the grip was visible, tight, desperate. This was not the man who had opened the hearing with tailored bravado and televised certainty. That man was gone. What remained was a shell, stripped of pretense, absorbing, finally, the cost of his own arrogance. Jasmine didn't gloat. Her power came not from humiliation, but from preparation. What she had delivered wasn't a public spectacle. It was precision justice, surgical, intentional, and utterly inescapable. The room began to shift around them, not suddenly, but like air pressure dropping before a storm. A whisper ran from the press bench to the staff rows, multiplying faster than anyone could trace the source. Laptops opened without instruction. Pens moved frantically. A junior aide to the majority leader leaned toward a colleague and murmured, "This isn't a scandal. It's a collapse." One C-SPAN technician, who had worked over 100 hearings, mouthed silently to the floor producer beside him, "We just filmed history." Jasmine remained seated, hands calmly resting on a closed folder, body still, gaze forward. But the room no longer belonged to Josh Hawley. It no longer belonged to the committee. It belonged to her, because everyone present now understood. This wasn't a debate over legislation. This was the dissection of a man's myth, performed live, by the woman he underestimated most. And then, only then, did she allow herself to look toward the press. The slow turn of her head felt choreographed by the gods of timing. Not because she practiced it, but because her instinct for when to move, when to be seen, was flawless. She scanned the back row where reporters stood packed shoulder to shoulder, jaws clenched, eyes wide. A New York Times correspondent had dropped his notepad without realizing. A producer for MSNBC had already texted, "Pull this now," to her control room. And Jasmine, never one to chase cameras, looked at them with a gaze that was quiet, but total. A gaze that said, "I know what you saw, you know what you saw, and none of us can pretend anymore." Then, without lifting her chin, without softening her posture, she allowed the corner of her mouth to rise. Not a grin, not a smirk. A confirmation, a subtle nod to the brutal efficiency of her work. She wasn't smiling because she'd won. She was smiling because it worked. Because the truth, long buried beneath noise, power, gender, and bias, had finally cut through. Because for once, in a building built to ignore women like her, they were listening. Not because she shouted louder, but because she waited, calculated, and chose the one moment they couldn't look away. And that, in Washington, is not just victory, it's transformation. And when Jasmine turned back to face the room, with every eye still fixed on her, every lie shattered, every defense system in flames, she did something no one expected. She smiled. Not with arrogance, not with cruelty, but with a calm, seismic kind of certainty. A smile that wasn't just confidence, it was prophecy fulfilled. She had known this moment would come, and when it did, it wasn't loud, it wasn't theatrical, it was quiet, surgical. 6 seconds of stillness, punctuated only by the faint glimmer in her eyes and the impossibly composed lift of her lips. The cameras caught it from 3 angles, one dead on from the center dais, another from the left press pit, catching the profile, the poise, the elegance, and one, accidental, perfect, from the rear of the room, slightly zoomed, framed with Hawley's slumped figure in the foreground and Jasmine's rising power just beyond him. That was the frame that detonated online. Within 45 minutes, the clip hit Twitter, short directs. The caption read, "She said nothing and destroyed everything." Capital smile. It gained 1.3 million views before the hour closed. Then TikTok picked it up. A Gen Z creator with 2.1 million followers paired it with slowed-down music. No voiceover, just a cinematic sting, and Jasmine's eyes locked on the camera as she smiled. A soundless takedown. The comment section exploded. "That smile is federal." "I've never seen power look like that before." "Forget mic drops. This is a surgical strike." "I don't care what side you're on. That woman just outplayed a senator on live TV." By midnight, it had spread across reels on Instagram, threads on Reddit, even Facebook timelines from users who hadn't posted in weeks. Journalists called it the smile heard around the chamber. Influencers dubbed it capital shift. But the internet, in all its chaotic clarity, gave it a name that stuck within hours. The capital smile. And it wasn't just the left that noticed. Even right-wing figures, hardened critics, habitual mockers, treaded carefully. One conservative radio host tweeted, "She didn't scream, she didn't interrupt, she didn't flinch, she smiled, and it landed harder than any Senate floor speech I've seen this year." A YouTube pundit known for skewering progressives tried to mock her, only to have his comment section overrun by thousands defending her precision and control. "You don't have to like her politics to admit That was a masterclass. When the truth is that clean, you don't need to yell it. And in that viral blaze, something deeper took root. Because for decades, women like Jasmine, black, unapologetic, overqualified, had been told to sit small, talk soft, stay pleasant. Power had rules, and those rules were written by men like Hawley. Rules that rewarded force but feared stillness, that rewarded rage but feared clarity, that tolerated noise but trembled at silence. But Jasmine hadn't just broken those rules. She had refused to play by them entirely. That 6-second smile became more than a meme. It became a symbol, a shorthand. It showed up on t-shirts the next day. Graphic designers rendered it into pop art prints that hung in DC dorm rooms by nightfall. A college student in Atlanta turned it into a moving poster, projected across the library wall. The capital smile, looped in golden tone, with the words, "She didn't raise her voice. She just raised the standard." And beneath the viral surge, the system began to feel its own tectonic shift. Aides to senators quietly downloaded the clip and watched it on loop in silence. At least 3 political consultants reportedly texted their clients, "You need to prepare. That's the new playbook." Cable networks broke their rigid partisanship for once. MSNBC praising her tactical elegance, CNN calling it the most devastating 6 seconds in modern political optics, and even Fox News begrudgingly admitting, "Whatever you think of her, Jasmine Crockett just rewrote the language of televised confrontation." But the true impact? It didn't land in headlines. It landed in living rooms. It was in the email from a retired school teacher in Ohio who wrote, "I never believed someone could stand there. Take all that fire and win with a look. But I saw her do it. I'll never forget it." It was in the post from a single mother in Dallas who said, "I show my daughter that clip before school, not because Jasmine Crockett yelled, but because she didn't have to." It was in the message from a young staffer on Capitol Hill. "I used to think you had to play along to stay here, that you had to swallow insults and just wait your turn. But she changed the air in that room. She changed what's possible. That's what no viral moment can fake. Not the views, not the shares, not the saturation, but the change in atmosphere, the unseen, unspoken moment when power finally shifts, when the rules of engagement no longer belong to those who wrote them decades ago." And Jasmine knew it. She never tweeted the clip, never posted it, never liked or acknowledged a single version of it. She let it live on its own. Let it move through the bloodstream of the country, through every timeline and group chat and headline, without ever claiming ownership. Because she didn't need to. The smile had spoken. It had said, "I came prepared. I waited. I let you underestimate me. And I finished you with 6 seconds and a closed mouth." That's what made it terrifying. Not the footage, not the scandal, not even the collapse of Hawley's posture or the unraveling of his voice, but the fact that Jasmine Crockett had shown the nation a new kind of confrontation, one that wasn't loud or cruel or performative, one that didn't seek applause, just clarity, one that didn't demand attention, just delivered consequence. And like any great political moment, it couldn't be controlled. It couldn't be spun or softened. It just was. A woman sat in a room she was never supposed to dominate, stayed quiet while a man tried to reduce her, then smiled and changed everything. That's why they called it the Capitol Smile, because it didn't just break a scandal, it broke the frame. But the true detonation came not from the chamber, not from Jasmine's smile, not even from the 6 seconds that turned into legend. It came the next morning, in the soft, quiet chaos of sunrise across DC, when inboxes overflow and screens light up with curated spin. A new kind of firestorm spread without warning. One by one, newsrooms that usually disagreed on everything ran the same headline, with only slight variations in tone or framing. Bronwyn Lang spotted with Elon Musk at multiple private events. Photos emerged linking Elon Musk and Senator Hawley's wife. Unusual appearances, Bronwyn Lang and Elon Musk seen together again. It wasn't loud at first. It didn't need to be. It was cold, surgical, no pundits shouting, no commentators theorizing, no wild speculation. Just the facts, stated plainly, backed by timestamps, images, eyewitness quotes, clips from the Austin Gala, a close-up of Musk's hand guiding her elbow through a crowd, another from a tech roundtable, her chair pulled subtly closer to his than protocol would ever require, still images with soft focus, a video segment muted but unmistakable in body language, and with each new frame released, the foundation beneath Hawley's silence cracked deeper. Not a single denial followed. Not from Bronwyn, not from Hawley, not from Musk's camp. No press releases, no clarifications, no friends of the family statements planted to soften the scandal. Just a silence so vast it became its own headline. And in that silence, the nation heard everything it needed to. News anchors grew cautious in their wording, but their eyes betrayed the verdict. We have yet to receive any comment from Senator Hawley's office. This developing situation raises questions about, well, about everything. The proximity, the timing, the optics, these are not coincidences. In political warfare, silence is rarely neutral, and Jasmine knew it. She didn't gloat, didn't post, didn't grant interviews or bask in the uproar. She let the void speak for itself. She had done her part. Calm, calculated, devastating. Now the rest was simply gravity taking over. Because in this town, the only thing worse than being attacked is being abandoned by your own narrative. And Hawley? He was suddenly nowhere. Cameras scanned the hill for him, but his schedule went dark. He skipped morning interviews, missed committee updates, his social media feeds, normally bursting with firebrand quotes and self-righteous threads, stayed frozen in time. No explanation, no misdirection, no bluster, just silence. And in a city addicted to noise, that kind of stillness is fatal. Staffers noticed first. His chief aide, normally quick with press deflection, was spotted pacing the hallway, phone clutched in both hands, whispering sharp commands that no one seemed able to execute. Interns at Capitol press briefings murmured, "He's spiraling." One insider texted a journalist, "He's not even angry. He's just quiet." And that's scarier. By late afternoon, cable news networks had stopped waiting. They called it for what it was. CNN aired a split screen. On one side, Jasmine Crockett walking into a town hall, greeted like a head of state. On the other, Josh Hawley's Senate office. Closed blinds, locked doors. The Chiron read, "Impact after the smile." Hawley's office silent amid growing speculation. Then MSNBC followed with a panel. What Hawley's silence says and what it can't defend. Even Fox News, usually loyal to the last breath, posed the question aloud. If it's not true, why not deny it? If this was all manipulation, where's the pushback? If he was blindsided, why not say so? But the most brutal coverage wasn't from the press. It was from the public. On social media, Americans, ordinary voters, worn down by years of polished hypocrisy, watched the scandal unfold with chilling clarity. One tweet, liked over 600,000 times, said, "He crucified women for standing up." Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She just told the truth. And now he's vanished. Another, "The man who lectured America about moral decay couldn't survive 6 seconds of accountability." And another paired with Jasmine's infamous smile. This is what integrity looks like when it stops asking permission. By the end of that first 24 hours, every major political strategist in Washington had rewritten their client briefing notes. Because this wasn't just a leak. It wasn't just a rumor. It was a shift. Jasmine hadn't just exposed an affair. She had exposed imbalance. She had cracked the illusion that power insulated the truth. She had reminded everyone watching, young staffers, old reporters, single moms, college students, that timing isn't everything. Preparation is. She had watched him posture, let him talk, let him bury himself in policy lingo, in smug righteousness. And then, at the precise moment when his guard was lowest, she delivered a truth so cold, so undeniable, it didn't need to scream. It just needed to exist. And now, Josh Hawley, the man who once dominated headlines with blistering rhetoric and moral fury, was reduced to silence. A silence that rang louder than any scandal. Because when you say nothing in the face of collapse, the world assumes one thing: You have nothing to say. And that is the sound of a career imploding, not in shouts, not in fire, but in a whisper that never comes. Jasmine Crockett didn't destroy Josh Hawley. She just let the truth walk in and do it for her. And while the Capitol outside buzzed like a struck beehive, while news anchors clashed live, while hashtags trended faster than anyone could track, inside Jasmine Crockett's office, the air was eerily still. The blinds were halfway closed, soft gold sunlight slicing through like spotlights on a stage set for a final scene. The door had been locked from the inside. Phones were on silent. Outside the hallway, press interns raced between offices. But inside this room, where the plan had been born and executed with brutal precision, no one moved for a long while. Until a young staffer, barely 2 years out of Georgetown, sleeves rolled, eyes wide with adrenaline, stood, cleared his throat, and held up a bottle of champagne. "We did it," he said, voice trembling. "They're calling it the quote of the year." Someone else chuckled under their breath, already holding their phone toward Jasmine. A social media post was racking up millions of views, looping the exact moment she said, "Josh, do you really want to talk about the exploitation of women today?" It was captioned with fire emojis and the phrase, "That's it. She ended him." Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't reach for the bottle, didn't glance at the screen. She just stood from her chair slowly, the weight of what she had just done settling across her shoulders like a tailored cloak. Her eyes, steady, focused, swept across the room, across the faces of young aides who looked at her now like she'd become myth. And then she said calmly, almost too softly to hear, "Put it away. This isn't a celebration." The room went still. A cork that had been half loosened was quietly resecured. The fizz in the air dissipated. One of the older aides, someone who'd worked through 4 administrations, nodded once, as if he'd been waiting for her to say exactly that. "This isn't a victory," she said louder this time. Her voice didn't shake, but it carried a gravity that pulled everyone's gaze in like a vacuum. "This is a warning shot." She didn't need to raise her voice because every syllable landed like a drumbeat. Not one staffer reached for their laptop. Not one aide dared tweet a thing. All of them, even the most junior, knew what she meant. She wasn't reveling. She was resetting the tone. Because what had just happened in that hearing chamber, what had detonated across the airwaves, wasn't just a scandal. It was a reckoning. And Jasmine, despite being the match that lit the fuse, refused to treat it like a bonfire to warm her ego. The room shifted from giddy celebration to sober awe. Someone whispered, "But they're already calling for an ethics review of Hawley's conduct." "We could," Jasmine cut in sharply, not unkindly, but with finality. "That's not why we did this." A pause. "We did it to remind them, all of them, that if you play games with truth long enough, truth starts playing back." From a corner of the room, a young woman with thick glasses asked what everyone else was too nervous to. "Should we prepare a press response in case something leaks?" Jasmine's lips curved, not into a smirk, not into smugness, but into something colder, wiser. She walked to the center of the room, lifted her eyes slowly, and with a tone wrapped in iron said, "Leaks?" Then she shook her head once, sharply. "No one leaked anything. He exposed himself." That line, those 6 words, sliced the air cleaner than any headline. He made himself the story. All I did was let him speak. A silence thicker than any in the hearing room settled now inside her office. And this time, it wasn't fear, it was reverence. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't just defeated an opponent, she had demonstrated discipline. She had resisted the bait, the urge to go viral before the story was ripe. She hadn't screamed, hadn't performed. She had waited, prepared, then acted, not for revenge, but for justice. And now she stood there, not as a victor, but as a warning. One aide whispered to another, "She just became untouchable." But Jasmine heard it and didn't smile. Instead, she turned to the whiteboard near her desk. It still held the original strategy notes, scrawled timelines, red arrows, initials, circled names. Hawley's name was underlined 3 times. A date next to it marked the day she got the photos. Another noted when she contacted the ethics attorney. Another, whistle number 3 confirms alibi. She stared at it for a long time. Then she took the marker, uncapped it, and in one motion erased the entire thing. Not just Hawley's name, not just the evidence chart, the entire board. Because this wasn't about Hawley anymore. It was about what's next. And she didn't want anyone thinking the mission was complete just because the first wall had cracked. Across the room, someone murmured, "So what now?" Jasmine turned to them, her voice calm again, but still coiled, like a bowstring drawn, but not yet released. "Now," she said, "now we clean our house." There was no cheering, no applause, just understanding, the kind that settles deep in the gut, the kind that tells you the real fight is just beginning. Because when a woman like Jasmine Crockett says this is a warning, what she means is, the next time, it won't just be one man's reputation at risk. It'll be the system that empowered him. And in that moment, with the champagne still unopened and the room silent, every aide in that office knew something had changed. Not just for Jasmine, but for all of them. For everybody watching. For the very balance of fear and accountability on Capitol Hill. Because the truth had shown up, and it had chosen a vessel. Not a perfect one, not a polished one, but a prepared one. And when Jasmine finally walked out of the office, flanked by silence, one intern whispered words that would appear in 3 op-eds the next morning. That wasn't a scandal. That was a standard being reset. And just like that, the storm that Jasmine had silently steered reached landfall. What began with a folder on a table had now ruptured the very foundation of Josh Hawley's political fortress. No headlines were needed to explain what followed, only the silence that came afterward. In the days after the hearing, Hawley vanished from the public eye like a general retreating from a battlefield scorched by his own arrogance. The cameras that once clamored for his attention found nothing but closed office doors, unanswered press inquiries, and rumors whispered in Capitol Hill hallways. His social media accounts fell eerily quiet. No videos, no statements, not even a denial. And in politics, silence is the loudest confession. One by one, his surrogates began to distance themselves, some issuing vague statements about reevaluating leadership, others deleting posts and pretending they were never close to him. It was as if the entire machine he had built on rhetoric, confidence, and sharp suits had short-circuited, burning itself from the inside out. The most brutal blow came from his donors. Major political action committees began retracting endorsements, pausing fundraising events, and worst of all, cutting the checks short. Emails leaked from his finance team revealed desperate subject lines: crisis strategy, urgent brand damage, and the chilling options for early exit. Hawley's flagship advocacy group, once a titan of conservative influence, quietly removed his name from its leadership page. Staffers were told to update branding to reflect internal restructuring. But everyone knew what that meant. He was toxic now, a liability, a symbol of what happens when unchecked power meets quiet precision. In Missouri, his home base, political allies began publicly debating potential replacements. Even longtime loyalists, mayors, governors, former colleagues, started expressing concerns. One major conservative radio host who once hailed Hawley as the future of American populism delivered a chilling monologue. When the light hits the cracks, what you thought was solid turns to dust. And we've seen dust. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett didn't tweet. She didn't post celebratory statements. She didn't leak follow-ups to the press. She simply returned to work. Her silence was not avoidance. It was strategy. The proof had already detonated. All she had to do now was wait for the smoke to clear and let the wreckage speak for itself. Even as Josh Hawley's silence deepened and his political empire crumbled in real time, the story had already moved on. But not in the way the media expected. There were no victory laps from Jasmine Crockett, no grand declarations. Instead, something quieter, more powerful, began to ripple outward. From dorm rooms and debate halls to policy forums and school libraries, young voices started to stir. On a rainy Thursday morning, tucked among thick folders of policy drafts and hearing notes, A plain envelope slid across Jasmine's desk. Handwritten, no return address. Inside was a letter from a coalition of university students studying law and public policy. It was raw, unfiltered, not polished for PR. One line stood out, underlined in thick black ink. The way you held your silence when you could have screamed. That's when we finally felt seen. Jasmine held the page in both hands, as if it were more fragile than paper. Her eyes didn't well up, but something shifted in her breath. That kind of letter didn't ask for change. It thanked her for being the change. She didn't read the letter aloud to her staff. She didn't post it on social media. She placed it neatly in a drawer she rarely opened, next to a photograph of her mother and an old bronze key that belonged to her first debate podium. Symbols, reminders, roots. Because some victories are not broadcast. They're whispered, passed down, lived through. That afternoon, as sunlight cracked through the storm clouds outside her office window, Jasmine walked down to a local school in D.C., fulfilling a promise to speak with a group of young students who had invited her months earlier. The auditorium was small, no cameras, no press, just folding chairs, scattered notebooks, and the wide-eyed curiosity of eighth graders who still believed truth had weight. After her talk on civic responsibility and how laws are shaped not just by words but by who dares to write them, a young girl, no older than 12, approached the podium, clutching a notebook to her chest. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she asked, "But what if they laugh when you stand up for what's right?" The room held its breath. Jasmine crouched down slightly, meeting the girl's eyes directly, unblinking. "They will," she said gently, "and sometimes they'll not just laugh. Sometimes they'll lie, twist, and try to break you." Then her voice grew firmer, no longer just answering the girl, but all who were listening. "But if you're standing on truth, you've already won. Even if no one claps." There was no applause, no cheers, just stillness. The kind of stillness that roots itself deep into young hearts and never leaves. And yet, long after the headlines faded, it wasn't the scandal that endured. It was the silence that followed and what it taught. In a city where power is currency and outrage is a daily trade, Jasmine Crockett had chosen neither. She could have doubled down. She could have danced on the ashes of a man's career. But instead, she walked away from the wreckage with no victory parade, no soundbite begging to go viral. That choice, restraint in a time of revenge, spoke louder than any speech. And in doing so, she shifted the conversation not just about Josh Hawley, but about the cost of truth in a world that often rewards the opposite. Her lesson wasn't about humiliation. It was about holding the line when you're outnumbered, unheard, and underestimated, and refusing to let the fire consume you too. She didn't need to tell people what to believe. She showed them. Over weeks, classrooms across the country began using her congressional clip in civics discussions, not for the scandal, but for the strategy. Professors highlighted how her decision to leak nothing, say little, and let the weight of facts do the talking turned the hearing into a slow-motion moral reversal. Even pundits who disagreed with her politics called it a masterclass in ethical warfare. No shouting, no name-calling. Just a controlled detonation of truth, delivered in quiet, precise doses. But the real lesson, the one that couldn't be captured in a headline, was the endurance it takes to stay calm when your name is dragged through fire. Jasmine had seen how lies spread faster than facts. She'd watched edited clips twist her tone, watched trolls flood her inbox with threats disguised as opinion. She had stood in hearings where her credibility was questioned before she even opened her mouth. And still, she waited, calculated, chose not to become what they accused her of being. That, she believed, was the real resistance. Not the reaction, but the refusal. Inside her office one evening, a young intern asked her a question no one else dared to. "Do you ever wish you had just taken him down harder?" Jasmine looked up from her notes. Her voice wasn't angry. It was low, steady. "Taking him down wouldn't have taught anyone anything," she replied. "But showing them how a lie unravels itself, that sticks." She tapped the folder still sitting on the edge of her desk. Unopened. Unused. Inside were stills, emails, full transcripts, enough to ignite a media firestorm, but it never left the drawer. Because power, she had learned, wasn't in exposure. It was in control. The cost of that control was real. Some said she missed her moment. Others claimed she went soft. But Jasmine knew something they didn't. Revenge is momentary. Integrity lasts. It's what gets whispered in locker rooms, passed in folded letters, etched in the memory of kids watching from home who've been taught that screaming is the only way to be heard. Her message was simple, brutal in its elegance. You can win without screaming. You can hurt without hating, and you can still stand, especially when no one claps. A month later, at a leadership summit in Philadelphia, she stood before a room of exhausted organizers and quietly shattered the myth of the strong black woman always having to roar. Strength, she said, is not volume. It's endurance. It's knowing when to fight and when to let the truth walk into the room by itself. Her voice didn't tremble. The crowd didn't cheer. They rose, slowly in unison, not because they'd been dazzled, but because they'd been seen. Jasmine knew injustice wasn't always a sharp blow. It was sometimes 1,000 paper cuts. It was being called angry for raising your voice, calculating for lowering it. It was watching men like Hawley weaponize morality while hiding behind carefully managed facades. But what she'd exposed wasn't just a scandal. It was the fragile ego of men who built careers on being untouchable. Her lesson? That ego only breaks in silence. And when young girls, especially young girls of color, watched the clip, they didn't see just a confrontation. They saw survival with dignity. One in particular, a high school senior from Oakland, wrote her a message. I've always thought I had to yell to be heard, but watching you made me want to whisper the truth louder than ever. That message stayed pinned above Jasmine's desk for weeks. It was proof that somewhere in the noise of politics, grace still echoed louder. She didn't romanticize the aftermath. The attacks didn't stop. The insinuations didn't slow. But neither did the letters. Neither did the quiet nods in hallways from staffers who'd never spoken to her before. Change, Jasmine learned, rarely arrives with applause. It arrives in silence, unnamed, untelevised, but felt deeply. She had once told a friend, I'm not here to be the storm. I'm here to be the pressure that shifts the sky. And when she left that final hearing, walking past rows of reporters still scrambling for spin, she carried nothing but her notes and a single phrase in her heart. Let the truth do its job. It did. And in doing so, it changed the rules. And yet, as Jasmine turned from the roar of headlines back toward the grinding silence of systemic injustice, she realized the truth by itself wasn't enough. It needed allies. It needed action. The Capitol was quieter now, but Jasmine's voice rang sharper than ever. Standing at the same podium where she had once been interrupted, diminished and mocked, she faced the press, not to declare victory, but to issue a warning. This wasn't just about Josh, she said, her tone cutting through the heavy air like a blade. This was about what we tolerate, what we normalize, and what we're no longer going to ignore. Behind her, a screen flickered with faces, not politicians, but everyday people, whistleblowers, teachers, nurses, organizers. Each had paid a price for telling the truth. Each had been gaslit, silenced, or made invisible. Jasmine didn't list laws. She listed names. She didn't talk policy. She talked pain. The room leaned forward, not out of curiosity, but out of conscience. She raised her hand and paused, letting the weight settle. If you're tired of watching people like me get interrupted in rooms we were elected to speak in, stand up. If you're tired of seeing the rich weaponize morality while dodging consequences, stand up. If you're tired of being told to wait your turn while the same people stay in power, lying with clean smiles and empty prayers, then don't wait. Her voice didn't rise in anger. It rose in clarity, like a siren through fog. I don't need applause. I need backup. That one sentence cracked through the cynicism. Across the country, people who had only watched politics passively now saw themselves drafted into something deeper. Not a campaign, not a party, a reckoning. Then came the final line, measured, lethal, unforgettable. The truth will keep fighting, with or without you. But if we fight together, it doesn't stand a chance of losing. No dramatics, No cue for music, just a woman who had been lied about, dismissed, and targeted, and who still stood tall with fire in her eyes. Jasmine Crockett didn't ask for permission. She gave direction. And for the first time in a long time, people didn't just hear a speech. They heard a call, and this time they answered. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.